collective trauma. What is it? Do you have it? Have you spread it? What are the symptoms? Let's get into it. Welcome to Want More with Dr. Moore, the criminologist of the day. I'm your host, Dr. Talia Moore, and today we are moving into session 2 of our 3-part session on all things Epstein. So sit back and enjoy the ride as we step into Criminology 101. We are going to be covering collective trauma. So what does that mean? How have we experienced it? Do you have it? We'll get into it right now. So the definition of collective trauma occurs when entire communities or societies experience psychological and emotional harm following a shared shock or revelation that fundamentally changes beliefs about safety, morality, and trust. Unlike individual trauma, collective trauma actually doesn't have to happen to everybody, at least not the precipitating event. It's more of like an impact that starts to consume people as more people share about the incident itself. In collective trauma, the damage is spread through shared awareness, so people knowing, definitely sharing and posting, and the profound realization that what we once believed is not the case anymore. So this ripple effect that occurs as a result of the shared collective trauma. Collective trauma doesn't require, like I said, that direct exposure, but it does require for this telling of incidents and stories to continue over and over again. And with the use of our social media, everyone having a phone and easy access to post anything at any time, this idea of information transmission that then results in collective trauma is easily actualized. Media coverage, social networks, and shared cultural narratives amplify the trauma. Yeah, I want to say they amplify the trauma. They create an experience of grief as well as disillusionment, to where we are so dialed in and focused on what happens. There may also be some ideas and things around us that we're not dialing in it on and taking into account. Communities process the shock together, which then reinforces the pain, which then reinforces the incident or the fact that it happened, and again, really recreates the collective trauma response that ensued. All right, so trauma, how does this collective trauma play out, and why is Epstein's name in everything? Well, that's a whole nother question, but stay tuned. That'll probably be session 3. All right, so applying collective trauma to revelations like the Epstein case. This case is continuing to evolve. We see so many things on the news, repeated exposure to all of these horrific allegations that have been made involving children being harmed, children being sexually exploited, even some children being unalived. So how does this play out in grander society? First, it shatters trust in power and protection. This idea that kids are safe, well, clearly that's been debunked. It also brings to mind and light the fact that wealthy people or the elite, they appear, at least at this time, to be free of consequence. And so this idea of justice is really rocked because it is not applicable clearly to everyone. If they couldn't protect those children, well, then who is safe? And that should be a question for all of us to be mindful of. Another peril associated with collective trauma, the moral injury at a social and societal level. When we think about our systems are shocked. The idea of abuse impacts how we perceive safety, how we perceive our systems to be operating in our best interest, and really starts to speak to the fact that things are hidden in plain sight. It creates a sense that society itself has failed, and this can lead to rage, cynicism, this feeling of numbness, no longer feeling anything at all, and polarization, where we now swing to one extreme or the other, none of which are truly healthy. So people struggle to reconcile the image of a civilized society, yet we are still having kids who are being abducted, abused, and really essentially discarded. The idea of this vicarious trauma that impacts all of us in society, despite the fact that we were not the initial victims in the incident. Right? All of these things are happening to us vicariously. We are being exposed. We hear every day that there's been a new page, a new document in the Epstein files that's been released that talks about all these things that are happening. We start to hear about all these political figures, all of these business people, all of the people that we held, at least at one point, to some level of esteem, who are now coming out as perpetrators, or at least people of interest associated with these horrific allegations of crime. All right. So those who are in the helping profession, those who engage with kids, those who may be working with people who have been trafficked, again, they may be impacted even more by this vicarious trauma because they're already working in environments where it exists. So collective trauma creates collective grief. And this is a collective grief for the victims that we do not know who they are, and we probably will never know who they were. Children who were never protected, a justice that was never actualized, and this loss of innocence, not just for the children, but for all of us in regards to how the world works. So this collective grief for our unseen victims also includes ourselves as well. The grief is often ambiguous. There's no clear ending, accountability, or ritual for closure, which keeps the trauma alive. All right, so we see a breakdown of our shared narratives. My story doesn't match your story. Our experience here in wherever we live is not in alignment to the stories of yesteryear. The idea of, hard work leads to fairness. Well, I don't think that was fair. No one is above the law. Well, that clearly isn't the case because we have seen very few people, if any, consequence associated with this. Children are our priority. Well, I'm sure that could be debunked as well, especially when we know that the ages of the victims were as young as 7 years old. They were teenagers, still children nonetheless. So these narratives fracture people, right? And as a result, people may disengage politically. You may start to see people throw all the politicians in the same bag and then throw that bag away. You may see people start to radicalize as a response to this, where maybe they're charged to respond in a way that they typically would not have, but they've been so motivated by this trauma that seems like the only response. Another breakdown, if you will, is this distrust across the board of all authority, where no one receives respect because everybody is suspect. And then lastly here, people may retreat into this space of hopelessness and really sit in that idea of the conspiracy theories that may exist. All right, so we see that there are a lot of impacts when we really dial down into collective trauma. How people are impacted, how we perceive the trauma, how it ripples out to everybody, and how if it continues in the news cycle or the media, the social media cycle, it continues on and on and on. All right, so some of the defining features here, and I've talked about them. So loss of trust, yes. Moral injury to all of society. We've all been impacted by this. Widespread emotions, either you hate it or maybe you are pro response, but everybody is kind of weighing in. And so now you have the gamut of emotions being thrown out there. Identity shifts. Communities ask, who are we if this is possible? And really start to question the inner workings of what community looks like and what we expect it to be. And then the generational impact, where now this shared collective trauma is going to be packaged up and it's going to be passed on to the next generation. So every story that we share will have elements of this. And so that our next generation is already being impacted by the trauma that we may be passing on to them as well. So when this trust collapse, really we start to see the destruction of society, societal norms, and expectations around systems that in society have been previously identified as protections for us. All right, so we have this moral injury, the ethical wound. Moral injury occurs when events violate our deepest ideas around right and wrong. And as we continue to find out more about the Epstein files, Epstein Island, Epstein nasty, right? All of these things are really tapping into our moral compass and really impacting us. All right, so when societies witness or learn of profound injustices, especially those perpetrated by trusted institutions, the psychological damage goes beyond fear or sadness. So we're not living and sitting in fear and sadness. We have elevated to the next level. So it creates a fundamental dissonance. What does that mean? Kind of like this disconnect here. How do we reconcile what happened with what we believe to be true? How do we recognize and acknowledge that something happened? And how do we bring it back to this space where we hope to exist and live and honor people, children's lives as well? So, this moral and ethical dilemma, if you will. We do have to question if this can happen in our society, then who are we? Are we people that allow children to be stolen, raped, beaten, abused, and thrown away? Or are we people with a higher moral compass that feels more responsible for protecting children? That is a dilemma that, while we may not want to acknowledge that that's where we are, that's where we are. So why does this matter? Well, us in society, we're still hurt, right? The collective trauma is still upon us. I feel the chip on my shoulder and it is weighing me down. And if you can relate, I'm sure many people can. That is our experience. And so that is why we need to be concerned, because we shouldn't be walking around with that much chip on our dip. So how does this matter? We have this idea or this belief around chronic distrust. We don't just trust anybody. Anybody come on the news, a politician, somebody who's running for office, they come and send us stuff in the mail. We don't believe anybody, but we have to choose somebody. It also serves to contribute to social fragmentation, where we have these silos where people are existing in isolation from one another. It does serve to re-traumatize survivor, because now they're seeing it just the same way that we all are every day, every single day, in all of the social medias and on all of the medias. How do we then respond to this? Well, if we want to process this collective trauma, because we need to start with one thing: telling the truth. Keep it real. Easier said than done. All right. There also needs to be a level of accountability where those who are involved are held accountable, and not a slap on the wrist, but actual real accountability for their behavior. The approach should maintain a client-centered focus, meaning it shouldn't be the response of just the justice system that motivates the response, but how do we listen to and help our victims in ensuring that they're the focus of the consequence in all actions moving forward. So listening to their voice, listening to their contributions, allowing them to weigh in and not just be thrown into the process at the very end. And then we also want to acknowledge the different cultures that have been impacted. How does that impact people? What does that look like? And how do we respond appropriately as well to that? So what does healing look like, right? So I talked about the collective trauma. We know all about it, right? The moral impacts, the ethical impacts, the heaviness, that heavy dip and chip on our shoulder, right? But how do we start to address healing as a society? Because hopefully, as the pendulum shifts, that is the direction that we're looking to move into. Like I said, truth telling without minimization. Don't say because, or at least she wasn't 7 or 8 years old. That's not the way that we actualize truth, right? That really is an example of minimizing the harm that has been impacted. So full transparency, no protecting reputations over children, and being accountable across power structures. So regardless of how much money or whatever your position is, everyone is held to the same standard. That level of accountability. Doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank or the title or however many letters you have behind your name. Everyone can get it. Another thing here, cultural shift around children and consent. How do we look at children and appreciate them and respect them? Children are not commodities that you can just trade and buy and ship and sell, right? So this idea of consent, yeah, just be mindful of what that looks like for children. They can't consent. Silence is complicity. So do nothing, say nothing. you about nothing, especially as we look at the kids who've been victimized. This idea of collective mourning and moral repair, how do we lean even more into that? Well, acknowledge the children who were not protected. Acknowledge the fact that there are some names that we'll never know. Acknowledge the fact that there are some people who will never or may never be held accountable for the harm that they caused. Allowing anger and sorrow without defensiveness. It's okay to be sad. Anna said what Elsa said, let it go, right? Let it go and show your emotions and don't feel obligated to hold them in, right? We can mourn collectively and emote collectively as well. This is moral repair. Admitting we failed, we are responsible to do better. So one hard truth as we look to shift the pendulum on the upswing here to respond to our collective trauma. Healing does not restore innocence. It restores integrity. And that is what our system is totally lacking at this point. The world may never feel that same level of safety again, especially here as we see every single day news stories that are slapping us in the brow. Societies don't heal by forgetting. And so the idea or the approach of just sweeping this underneath the rug, that's not healing. That's turning a blind eye to a horrible situation. They heal by changing how they operate, but it can become more honest, safer, and a much more humane environment. And that should be our focus. So I just want to say thank you for your time. Hopefully you enjoyed session 2, and we will be back for session 3, Criminology 101, all things Epstein. Be sure to follow, like, subscribe, and comment. And until next time, educate, empower, and enact the changes you want to see. Want more.
Want more with Dr. Moore, the criminologist of the Bay? Follow us on Facebook at Want More, Instagram at Want More Dr. Moore for more information. Be sure to comment, like, share, and subscribe.